Hey everybody, my previous petunia videos have garnered a lot of questions about how we trim our petunias. So today I've got my snips and I'm going to show you exactly how and when we trim our petunias. So I have a variety of petunias here, kind of at different stages, different types of growth and vigor for these plants. So hopefully I can kind of give you a peek and some ideas on how maybe you're going to do yours. I realize that probably a lot of these questions came in from people who are propagating their own petunias. So they started from seeds, or maybe they stuck some vegetative cuttings or something like that. We get all of our petunias in as rooted plugs. So they're in little plugs that are the size of maybe my pinky or my thumb, depending on how big we get them. So they're pretty far along. And so I can't speak for what happens before that point, but usually we get them in and they'll have, a good bit of growth on them, but they're definitely not at a point, at least when we get them, where they need trimming. When we put them into these 4.5-inch pots or 4-inch pots, we do cut off any buds or any flowers because we want to encourage root growth. And then once they're in there, we usually keep them at usually like between 65 and 70 degrees. That's usually a good temperature for petunias to encourage that root growth, because we don't want them putting energy into flowers or anything like that. We want that growth happening in the soil and them kind of taking over. Usually within a week to 10 days, we'll see this big spurt of growth starting. So we know that the rooting has taken place. We're fortunate because in these pots, we can usually just kind of flip them up and we can take a look and you can see the roots are kind of all the way around and they go all the way to the bottom. So that for us is a sign that, okay, if we want to do some trimming, now is a good time if the plant has grown enough. Meanwhile, if you have put them into maybe a bigger container or a flower bed, you're not going to have that luxury. You don't want to go in and disturb those roots at all. So you'll just have to do it from what you see up above. So that's how that works. Let's see. Once they are well rooted, we can usually drop the temperature down to more like 55 or so. They'll do really well. Now, an alternative to trimming is dropping the temperature down even lower. Petunias have a hold temperature, and that hold temperature is usually between 40 and 50 degrees. So if you keep it in that 40 to 50 degree range, usually the petunias will grow really, really slow, and you really won't have to do much trimming at all. But a lot of people, I think if you're starting from seed, you're eager to get them up to size pretty quick. Petunias also are pretty good about the cold. So if they were kind of in that 40 to 50 degree range, and then you did have temperatures that started dropping, they can get all the way down to freezing if they're kind of tempered for it. So they're pretty hardy when it comes to the cold weather. So we're lucky that way. And also, like in this greenhouse, it can get, like at night, it can get down to 60 or whatever. So even when they're rooting, I don't have to worry because they're in the soil. So the air temperature might get down to 60, but the soil, the temperature takes a lot longer to drop. So it's not as susceptible to those temperature drops. So the roots kind of stay the same. So I think we better get down to talking about trimming now, shouldn't we? So let's take a closer look at what we've got here. So I always start with sterile snips, and what I use is just a spray bottle of isopropyl alcohol. I spray the snips down, I make sure that I don't get any of the alcohol on any of the plants around me. Then I will let my snips air dry. And it's important to do that because there's some plants that if you have alcohol on them, it will kind of brown the plant wherever it touches it. Petunias aren't so fussy about that, but it's a really good habit to get into. Now this one here is the Petunia Coral, and this is one of the more compact varieties, and although it's put on some good root growth, I checked that earlier, it's still a relatively small petunia. We're starting to see a little bit of growth in here, but I wouldn't say this is ready for major trimming, but it is a good idea to trim off some of the flowers. So when I look at this right in here, you can see the petal here. And then what we want to do is not just trim off the flower, but also get below into this kind of pedicel area here and trim that off, because this area in here, that green area, that's where the receptacle for the seeds are. So we want to kind of discourage any kind of seed growth. I did see this is another bloom, so I'm going to just trim that one off. Oh, sorry, I'm kind of doing this looking through the camera and looking in person. So this one here, not ready for major trimming, but I did cut the flowers off. Now it's going to hopefully put some more energy into these branches. So over here, this one is one of the new varieties of yellows, and yellows have come a long way in the petunia world recently. They used to be very, very pale. The new ones are getting brighter and more intense. This one is the Super Cal Premium Yellow Sun. Absolutely love it. Again, another one that's still a little small. Looks like we had either a little bit of drought or heat scorch, probably wasn't getting enough water. That's why we're seeing a little action on the tips there. We'll go ahead and snip that off. At least that's my theory. I'm not an expert on this type of thing, but I'm gonna just cut these buds off. And I'm also making sure that I get rid of any waste and that I'm going to put into a compost, because I do not want any of this stuff kind of growing or molding into my pot, because that can cause some root damage. Now this one is ready for a bit of a trim, and this one is the Mayan Sunset. I think it's from the Flower Shower series. So you can see it's got this branch that's coming out, and what I want you to look at is in here, there's a lot of growth happening right there, but it's just these little, tidbits kind of sticking up. If I cut this right around that area, we're going to start seeing a lot of growth right here in this spot, and that's going to really be great for this plant. Now this one I'm just going to trim off. Now this one looks really puny now, but we're going to see these take off really quick, because these are really ready to really burst forward. So we're happy about that, because that means it's doing exactly what it should. Now this is also another super cal. This one is called White Pearl. And you know what, before I go any farther, I'm going to make sure and tuck in my tags, because I do not want to, once they're trimmed, I can't see the flowers anymore. So White Pearl is, like a lot of the super cals, has a really cool iridescent kind of coloring on that white. So it's not just a white petunia, it's got really nice kind of pearlized finish there. And this one, again, I can cut off the flowers, but it is not ready for any kind of cutting of branches. So you can see it looks pretty, like I kind of hacked it, but that's all I did was cut those flower buds off. Now hopefully it's going to encourage that growth in the branching and in the leaves in that area. So I'm going to move over to one of the bigger ones. So this one here is called Orchid Frost. So this one definitely has some growth going on here, and it grows a little bit differently than some of the other ones I showed you. So this one here, again, when you look at where the leaves meet the stem, you can see where it's ready for even more growth in there. So it's ready for me to cut that off, and you can see I usually go closer to the leaf set, so that way I don't have any kind of stump sticking up afterwards. So we're just going to cut those off. And again, when you're trimming like this, there's not a one-size-fits-all kind of way of doing this. So you might have other people who try different things that work for them. I'm actually going to take this one off too, just because I feel very adventurous. So there you go. So this one's been nicely trimmed. We're going to see more branching. These little parts down here are going to really start taking off now too, because the plant's ready to start putting that energy down a little bit more. Now I'm going to get this Surfinia Heavenly Cabernet. Again, grows a little bit more like the last one I showed you. We have some good branching on here. It's definitely ready to kind of take a trim. Again, I want to get all those pieces out of there, but if you look in there, you can see these are ready for takeoff. Can you see that? I hope so. So I'm going to trim that off. Going to get this flower out of here. I'm going to take this branch off as well, and we're going to just see it kind of continue to mound up and look really great. So again, that one was the Surfinia Heavenly Cabernet. Get that tag in there. This one must have been the Pearl. No, that was the Flower Shower. Uh-oh, look at this. Look what I did. Already messed them up. So this one goes there, and this one goes down here. Fingers crossed that I didn't mess up my tags. I should have probably left the tags in. Now, we're going to look at a couple others here. So this is a wave petunia. Waves get really big, and you can see it's starting to its branching, but it's still relatively small. This one's kind of at the in-between stage. So I'm going to cut the flower off, and now when we look at there, it's starting to grow here and starting to grow here. If I had a whole bunch of these, I would definitely kind of give it another, well, probably one more sunny day, and we're going to see a lot of length on these. But because I'm doing them, I'm going to do them right now and get them over with, so that way I don't have to worry about it. But you can see lots of room for growth, and that's where we're going to see that new growth coming from down there. So this is going to be a really beautiful plant. I want to also make sure and show you one of the Supertunias. So this is Supertunia Royal Velvet. It has some spent flowers on it, and one thing I'm going to show you about this is these have a really good natural branching habit, but they can really kind of take over on us as well. But I'm going to encourage even more branching just by cutting some of these off and getting these flowers off of here. And also, part of the reason, when they're in the greenhouse, they don't deadhead themselves, whereas when they're out in your yard, the wind actually blows these blooms off. But in the greenhouse, we don't have that air movement, so they're not as self-cleaning. So I'm going to take this one down as well. These bounce back pretty quickly, so I'm not too worried about it. I see there's this one down here growing outwards. I wonder if I should trim that. I'm going to leave it for now. When we're doing these, a lot of times we use the edge of the pot as kind of our measure. So we are planning to move these petunias into a cooler greenhouse. Now, after trimming, we usually wait almost a week before we make that move. We start looking for that new growth coming back on, and then we'll move it in. We don't want to trim them and then give them any kind of extra shock. So that extra shock could be a temperature change. It could be putting them out in the sun without enough water. Any of that kind of stuff is going to stress them out a little bit more, because trimming is a little bit of a stress on them, but petunias ultimately do like to be trimmed. Now, later on in the season, I usually say right after the 4th of July, usually our petunias are starting to cascade over the side of our pots, but that's also when they might start looking a little leggy or kind of getting a little bigger than they need to be. A lot of times at that point I cut off about 20%, kind of off the end, kind of getting it so that it's still just over the pot, but tightening up, and that kind of rejuvenates the plant as well. So it's going to create a little bit more growth from the center of the pot outwards. And with that, the plant's pretty mature at that point. You just kind of go in and give it, think of it as a haircut. You're just going around giving it a cut then. And I have done a little bit of a video on that before, but that one you can figure out pretty easily. You just trim it back. They bounce back pretty quick. And after that trim, that's when I usually do give them some good liquid fertilizer, and they respond really, really well. So I hope this helped, and I hope my video skills weren't too shaky. Thanks for hanging in there with me. I'll talk to you guys all very, very soon.